Have you ever felt eyes on you in the dark, eyes that shouldn't be there? In the forgotten corners of small towns, where the streetlights flicker and shadows grow too long, whispers tell of something watching. Something waiting. In Willow Springs, a traveling circus brought more than laughter and joy. It brought fear. 3 people vanished, and the circus disappeared overnight, leaving only rumors of a figure that lingers in the dark. They say if you look too closely, it will find you. If you step into its world, it will never let you leave. This is the story of Jason Reed and the Shadowed Clown. Chapter 1: Seeds of Despair. Willow Springs was the kind of town you could drive through and forget existed the moment you left. Faded storefronts, an aging gas station, and a single diner made up most of the main street. People who lived there rarely left, and strangers rarely stopped by. Until the circus came. It arrived on a suffocatingly hot night in late June. Trucks rolled into town, their paint chipped and their logos barely visible. By morning, the barren field on the edge of town had transformed into something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Bright tents, flickering lights, and garish colors beckoned the townsfolk. For a week, the circus enchanted Willow Springs. But after the final show, the tents were gone. And so were 3 people. Jason Reed, a 30-something journalist, was no stranger to weird stories. Small-town folklore wasn't exactly Pulitzer material, but it paid the bills, and his editor loved eerie human interest pieces. When whispers of the Willow Springs circus reached his inbox, he couldn't resist. Jason's research turned up the usual gossip, a circus that vanished overnight, rumors of strange happenings, and, of course, the disappearances. But there was one detail that stood out. Multiple accounts mentioned a clown, always in the background, always watching. They called him the Shadowed Clown. The road to Willow Springs was long and empty. By the time Jason arrived, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the sleepy town. His first stop was a tired-looking motel with a neon sign blinking the word vacancy in a broken rhythm. The man at the front desk, wiry and hunched, barely looked up when Jason walked in. "You hear about the circus?" the man asked before Jason could even introduce himself. Caught off guard, Jason nodded. "Yeah, heard some strange things about it." The old man sighed, his eyes narrowing as if deciding how much to say. "You should leave it alone," he said finally. "Some stories are better left untold." Jason offered a polite smile, but he didn't drive 3 hours to back out now. The next morning, Jason began his investigation. He walked through the town, speaking to anyone who was willing to share their memories of that summer. Most avoided his questions, their faces tightening at the mention of the circus. One woman, standing outside the diner, offered a cryptic warning. "It's still here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The clown. It waits in the dark." Jason dismissed it as small-town superstition, but as the day went on, a pattern emerged. Those who spoke of the clown described it as a fleeting presence, seen in reflections, glimpsed in alleyways, or felt as an oppressive weight in empty rooms. Determined to find something concrete, Jason drove out to the field where the circus once stood. The grass had grown wild, but faint tire tracks were still visible in the dirt. As he walked, the air grew unnaturally still. His foot hit something metallic. Bending down, he brushed away dirt to reveal a rusted sign. The words were barely legible, but with some effort, he could make out. "Welcome to the Dark Laugh Circus." Jason felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked around, but the field was empty. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The wind picked up, carrying what sounded like faint laughter. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, but his voice sounded hollow in the quiet. Back at the motel, Jason typed up his notes, the faint glow of his laptop screen illuminating the room. He couldn't stop replaying the day's events in his mind. The laughter, the stories, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. As the clock neared midnight, Jason decided to call it a night. He turned off the lights and settled into bed. That's when he heard it. A soft tap. He froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time louder. It was coming from the window. Slowly, Jason turned his head. The curtains were closed, but the faint outline of a shadow was visible through the thin fabric. It didn't move. It just stood there. Jason's heart pounded as he reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. He turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the window. The shadow was gone. For the rest of the night, Jason didn't sleep. Chapter 2: Descent into Madness. Jason spent the morning poring over the notes he had taken, his mind unable to shake the image of the shadow at the window. Though he had convinced himself it was just a trick of his exhausted imagination, there was an itch in the back of his mind, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. At the local library, Jason dug deeper into Willow Springs history. The librarian, a frail woman with thick glasses, seemed hesitant to help at first but relented after he explained his research. She led him to a dusty archive in the back of the library and handed him a box of old newspapers. "You're not the first to look into this," she murmured. "But none of them ever find what they're looking for." Jason flipped through the yellowed pages, his heart skipping a beat when he found an article titled "Circus Disappears Overnight, 3 Missing." The piece described the sudden departure of the Dark Laugh Circus and detailed the missing persons: a teenage boy, a middle-aged woman, and a local farmer. What caught Jason's attention, though, was the mention of strange sightings following the circus disappearance. Residents reported glimpses of a figure in dark alleys and reflections, always just out of reach, always watching. As the sun set, Jason drove back to the old field. Something about the place pulled him in, like an itch he couldn't scratch. He parked his car at the edge of the overgrown grass and stepped out, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. This time, he came prepared. Jason carried a camera, determined to document any strange occurrences. But as he wandered deeper into the field, the air grew thick, almost oppressive. The wind, which had been steady all day, suddenly died. Then, he saw it. At the far end of the field, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, stood a figure. It was unmistakably a clown. Its oversized shoes and baggy pants gave it away, but its face was hidden in the shadows. Jason's breath hitched as he raised his camera, the lens trembling in his hands. The figure didn't move. Jason snapped a photo, the flash lighting up the field for a brief second. When his vision adjusted, the clown was gone. That night, back at the motel, Jason reviewed the photos he had taken. Most were empty shots of the field, but one image made his blood run cold. There, in the background, barely visible but undeniably present, was the clown. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes seemed to glow faintly, even in the photograph. Jason locked the door and closed the curtains, the weight of unease pressing down on him. The laughter began again, faint at first, then louder, as if circling the building. "Just your imagination," he whispered to himself. But the sound of tapping at the window made him freeze. He didn't dare look. The next day, Jason confronted the librarian about what he had found. She paled at the mention of the clown. "It's not a legend," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say the clown is a watcher. It sees those who dig too deep. And once it sees you, it doesn't stop." Jason pressed her for more details, but she shook her head. "That's all I know. Or all I'm willing to say." As Jason returned to his car, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The paper was crisp and clean, as though it had just been placed there. In red ink, the words "Come back tonight" were scrawled in an elegant, looping script. Jason's pulse quickened. Was someone watching him? Was it a prank? Against his better judgment, Jason decided to return to the field. When he arrived that night, the field was eerily silent. The moonlight illuminated the rusted sign of the Dark Laugh Circus, and for a moment, Jason hesitated. But curiosity and stubbornness propelled him forward. He wandered deeper into the field, his flashlight sweeping across the tall grass. The laughter began softly, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Jason spun around, but the field was empty. Then, the spotlight hit him. Jason shielded his eyes as a bright beam of light illuminated him from above. The sound of applause echoed in his ears, though he couldn't see where it was coming from. Panic set in as he realized the field had transformed. The grass was gone, replaced by a circular dirt floor surrounded by empty bleachers. He was in a ring, and in the center of the bleachers sat the clown. Its painted smile stretched too wide, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Chapter 3: The Abyss Stares Back. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood frozen in the middle of the ring. The spotlight's blinding beam made it impossible to see beyond its edges, but the sound of applause still echoed, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to circle him. He turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand, but the beam seemed powerless against the darkness beyond the spotlight. The bleachers were empty, except for the clown. It hadn't moved. Yet, Jason felt its presence growing heavier, its stare burrowing into his chest like cold needles. "Who's there?" Jason's voice cracked as he yelled into the void. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it was deafening. Then, the clown's head tilted. Jason stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The clown's head tilted further, the motion unnaturally slow, as if it were testing the limits of its own body. Its glowing eyes burned brighter, 2 pinpricks of light in the suffocating darkness. "Stay back," Jason shouted, swinging his flashlight toward the figure. But the moment the light touched it, the clown was gone. The spotlight went out. Jason was plunged into darkness so absolute it felt as though he had been swallowed whole. His breathing echoed in his ears, his fingers fumbling for his phone. When he finally managed to turn on the flashlight, he realized he wasn't alone. Dozens of figures now stood in the shadows around the ring, their faces obscured but their silhouettes unmistakably human. Jason's flashlight flickered as he spun around, desperately trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figures remained still, their outlines motionless but oppressive. One by one, they began to step forward, each movement slow and deliberate. Jason's heart raced as he stumbled backward, the whispers returning, louder this time and layered with strange, otherworldly tones. "You came to see the show," one voice said, disjointed and hollow. "You're part of it now," said another. Jason's flashlight passed over a figure that seemed familiar. His blood turned cold as he realized it was the face of a young man, the teenager who had gone missing decades ago. The clown's voice broke through the whispers, low and distorted, like the sound of a needle dragging across a record. "Do you see them?" it asked. "Do you see what you've disturbed?" Jason turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling. The clown was back, standing impossibly close now. Its painted smile was smeared, its once bright colors dulled by grime and age. "What do you want?" Jason choked out, his voice barely audible. The clown leaned forward, its face inches from Jason's. The air grew colder as it spoke again. "To remember," it whispered. "To be seen. The horrors of the past." Jason was overwhelmed by a sudden, vivid vision. The field around him transformed into a chaotic flurry of color and sound. He saw the dark laugh circus in its prime, tense, vibrant, and alive, music blaring, and a crowd cheering. But the scene twisted. The music became warped, the laughter shrill and distorted. He saw the 3 missing people, now part of the show, their faces painted and frozen in grotesque smiles. They danced and performed as if puppet, their movements jerky and unnatural. Jason screamed as the vision shifted again. The clown, now towering over him, extended a hand. Its voice echoed in his mind. "Join us." Jason broke free from the vision, his mind reeling. He turned and ran, his legs burning as he sprinted across the field. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more chaotic, until they became an ear-splitting cacophony. The edge of the field was in sight when Jason tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. As he scrambled to his feet, he felt a hand grip his ankle. Looking back, he saw the clown's face staring up at him from the ground. Its mouth twisted into an impossibly wide grin as it whispered, "The light doesn't save you." Jason kicked free, stumbling back to his car. He slammed the door shut, fumbling to start the engine. As the headlights illuminated the field, it was empty. No figures. No clown. Jason didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clown's face. Its voice echoed in his mind, repeating the same words. To remember. To be seen. By morning, Jason had convinced himself it was a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But when he reviewed the photos on his camera, his blood ran cold. In every shot of the field, the clown was there. Sometimes in the distance, sometimes right behind him. The final photo showed Jason himself, standing in the spotlight, with the clown's hands resting on his shoulders. Chapter 4, When the Light Goes Out. Jason hadn't left the motel room all day. His camera sat on the desk, its screen black, but the images it contained burned in his mind. Every frame, every angle, no matter where he pointed the lens, the clown had been there. Always watching. The note on his windshield, the whispers, the vision in the field, it all pointed to one inescapable truth: the clown wasn't just a story. It was real. And it wasn't done with him. As night fell, Jason's phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him from his spiraling thoughts. The screen lit up with a notification. Unknown number, don't turn off the lights. Jason stared at the message, dread pooling in his stomach. Before he could respond, the power went out. The room was plunged into pitch blackness. Jason fumbled for his phone, its faint glow barely enough to illuminate the immediate area. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the darkness itself was pressing against his skin. Then he heard it, the faint sound of laughter. It started softly, distant and almost playful, but it grew louder, closer, more distorted. Jason's pulse quickened as he turned the flashlight on his phone toward the door. The laughter stopped. But there, just visible in the beam of light, was the outline of a handprint on the motel room door. Slowly, it began to drag downward, leaving streaks as if the wood itself was rotting under its touch. Jason bolted out of the room, his flashlight bouncing erratically as he sprinted into the night. The streets of Willow Springs were eerily empty, the dim glow of the moon barely enough to guide him. As he ran, the whispers began again. They came from every direction, overlapping and growing louder until they drowned out his thoughts. "You can't leave," they hissed. "You're part of it now." Jason stopped in his tracks as the world around him seemed to shift. The streets twisted, stretching unnaturally, and the buildings faded into a haze. Ahead, the field reappeared, its crooked sign illuminated by a faint red glow. "Welcome to the Dark Laugh Circus." Jason was drawn back to the center of the field, as if his feet were moving on their own. The bleachers were full now, each seat occupied by a figure shrouded in darkness. Their faces were obscured, but Jason could feel their eyes on him. In the center of the ring, the clown stood waiting. Its painted smile had twisted into something monstrous, the colors of its costume bleeding into its pale skin. It didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. Jason felt his knees buckle as the clown raised one hand, pointing to the spotlight above. It clicked on, bathing him in its harsh glow. The whispers returned, louder than ever, but this time they were clearer. They weren't coming from the crowd. They were coming from Jason's own mind. "Join the show," they urged. "Take your place." Jason's voice cracked as he screamed, "What do you want from me?" The clown stepped closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It extended a hand toward Jason, its voice echoing both in the air and in his thoughts. "Choose," it said. "Become one of us, or stay in the shadows forever." Jason's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, their anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Behind the clown, he saw the three missing townsfolk, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and despair. Jason took a step back, shaking his head. "No," he whispered. "You can't make me." The clown's smile widened, impossibly large now, as it tilted its head. "You already chose," it said. The spotlight flickered. Jason turned to run, but the ground beneath him gave way. He fell into darkness, the sound of applause and laughter echoing in his ears as the world around him dissolved. Weeks later, a new circus appeared in a town miles away. Its garish tents and flashing lights drew the curious and the unwary. Among the performers was a new clown. His painted smile was crooked, his movements stiff and jerky, as though he were a puppet on invisible strings. But his eyes were alive. The story of the Dark Laugh Circus faded into obscurity, just another urban legend passed around campfires and whispered in small towns. But for those who dared to look too closely, the truth lingered. In every town the circus visited, someone always disappeared. And the clown? It was always there, waiting in the shadows where the light couldn't reach.